Hello, everyone. Welcome to Meet the World, brought to you by the National Centre for Writing and in Norwich, the UK, and the National Arts Council of Singapore. And today we're going to talk to two extraordinary writers, Lisabelle Tay and Heather Parry, respectively based in Singapore and Glasgow. And my name is Yan Ge. I'm based in Norwich. And we're going to be talking about those two writers' writings and also while circling around the theme, hopefully, of grief, the body, and derangement. And so I think what I'm going to do first is I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists, the two writers. So I'm going to introduce Heather first. Um, Heather Parry is a Glasgow-based writer and editor, originally from South Yorkshire. Her debut novel, Orpheus Builds, was shortlisted for the Saltire Society Fiction Book of the Year Award and longlisted for the Polari First Book Prize. She is also the author of a short story collection, This Is My Body, Given for You, and her first non-fiction book, Electric Dreams, on sex, robots, and the failed promises of capitalism. I really want to get this book. Was released in 2024 as part of 404 Inc.'s Inking series. Her next novel, Carrion Crow, is forthcoming via Doubleday in February 2025, to be followed by a short story collection in 2026. And then we come to Lisabelle. Lisabelle Tay is a Singaporean writer and poet. Her poetry appears in Anthropocene, Bad Lilies, and elsewhere, including New Singaporean Poetry. Her debut pamphlet was Pilgrim. Her fiction appears in Sign Theta magazine and elsewhere, including No Flash. She was part of the 2023 Blacklist Feature Lab with her screenplay Momo, which is currently in development. And my name is Yan Ge, and I'm a writer in both Chinese and English. I'm currently based in Norwich, and I'm working on something that I'm not super proud of. So, shall we start our conversation after my super clumsy opening? And I feel like reading other people's bio is like quite difficult. It's like the most challenging part of being the chair. I have actually practiced reading your bios out before this event, and all the rehearsals turned out to be a lot better than the actual. It's just just get tripped over. I'm so sorry. But yeah, I think I'm just gonna fully embrace my clumsiness. This is gonna be my strategy. So it's just gonna be what it is. Um, so let's kickstart our conversation by some maybe like a fun, casual, or general questions. First I'm gonna ask both of you to tell us one thing that is not in your bio. Tell us something we haven't already learned from your bio about yourself.
Sure. I think you did the bios beautifully, by the way. Is a really difficult thing, and you realize you've made them about 1,000 words long. And when the other person's reading it, you think no one needs to know all this about me. But a thing I don't put on my bio is that I used to run a drum and bass club in Sydney, Australia, very briefly. That's a random fact about me.
Gosh, I was not prepared for random facts. Like, random fact about me. I live right in the center of Singapore. Singapore is a very small island. Like, it's tiny. You can get around it in a couple of hours. And I live smack in the center in this place called like Bishan. Yes. Any Singaporeans listening to this now, I'm gonna be laughing. That's the most boring thing I could possibly have joked. But there you go.
Now we know exactly where you are.
That's like almost I wanted to say, could you describe the room you're in? I'm not going to do that. Let's go to our second casual and fun question, and that I'm going to ask you. I think it's kind of a bit of a cliche, but I think it's quite useful for everybody to know actually what brought you to literature in the first place. Heather, would you like to go again, like first?
I mean, I didn't really admit to myself that I wanted to write fiction until I was in my late 20s. And I think that's because I was so terrified of it. You know, the thing you want most in the world, you often don't let yourself look at it because it's so scary. Um, I mean, from about the age of 16, I knew I wanted to write, but I thought I wanted to be a music journalist. Specifically, I wanted to be the music journalist Lester Bangs, who was like a 60s, 70s era, like white male American music writer who used to take a lot of drugs and go on these like unhinged kind of semi-fictionalized interviews with people like Lou Reed. So I thought I wanted to kind of be him for a long time. And I do write nonfiction now as well, but when I first started thinking I wanted to really take fiction seriously, it was when I moved to Scotland about 10 years ago now. And I just didn't grow up in the kind of place where we knew anyone who wrote for a living, or you knew a writer, or you knew anyone really working in the creative industries. So I think moving to Scotland with their amazing literature scene, it really helped kind of convince me that maybe I could.
The same for me as well. I started writing quite late, like in my mid-20s, I suppose. Even though I technically been writing very bad poems, right, since I was a child. But I always told myself, like, no one's a writer. Like, let me tell you, in Singapore, no one grows up thinking I'm gonna be a writer. Uh, maybe more so now, but like definitely not when I was a kid. Everyone's like, yeah, you're gonna be a lawyer because you can't do math, so you can't be an economist. Like, can't do science, so you can't be a doctor. So you're just gonna be a lawyer. But yes, and I think in my late 20s, I started taking writing a bit more seriously. I felt very ill, so kind of like, my typical like government scholarship plans had gone out the window. So what else could I do? And so I started writing poetry, and then the Emma Press picked up my pamphlet, which was really like a great experience for me. And I think that was when my writing really, like, I started taking it seriously.
I heard that being a lawyer is not too dissimilar to being a fictionist because I don't know. This is what I was told. I was like, practicing law is basically telling stories. I was like, okay.
Do you know, a lawyer a lawyer who wrote a nonfiction book told me that as well, and said actually there's a lot of crossover because you have to be interested in everything. You have to be really dogged about finding the details of something, and you have to have a kind of wide range of knowledge. So maybe as a fallback career, we can have law, right?
Fallback, yeah. I don't think it can go the other way around. I feel like it's because I know a couple of lawyer turned writers, and they doing swimmingly well. And I don't think you can like go the other way around as least I can. And yeah, my backup plan is to be a typist. If I completely like run out of ideas to write, I would just like go become somebody's secretary. I'm very good at like tidying up places and like typing fast. So shall we just then kind of go into the things we're gonna talk about today, and maybe first like unpack today's theme a little bit. And so Lisabelle came up with a theme which I thought it was extraordinary, and the juxtaposition of the three ideas: grief, the body, and derangement. I think in this set of notions, this is just my own take, the body is definitely the central pivot. It feels to me that when we talk about the body in the context of literature, it often connotes a female body or a female point of view, um, associated with themes of oppression and objectification. So I just wanted to ask, like, what's your take on the body, and how significant would you say the notion of the body is to your work? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I go so far as to say, I guess all my work so far has been about the body. So my first pamphlet, the one with the Emma Press, I wrote it when I was very ill, and I think and that definitely comes through. So a lot of poems about like the sick body, right? And then my first short stories were retellings of like really classic Southeast Asian folk tales, specifically kind of like horror like tales with like female monsters. And I think the monster's body is very key to its monstrosity, right? And perhaps especially so with, the female monster. And my first short stories were about the Pontianak and the Penanggalan. So the Pontianak is this what we call a hantu. It's like a female ghost kind of, and you kill her by driving a nail into the back of like her skull. And like she appears beautiful except when she appears decayed, right? Okay. But and the Penanggalan is like another monster whose head like detaches from her body at night, and her head, you know, um, flies around with the entrails dangling. And so obviously these monsters are very embodied in their horror, right? And so I think from the very start there was a preoccupation with like the grotesque body and the abused body and the sick body, right, as a site, I think, of disruption and transcendence. And my current work is also very preoccupied with the body, although perhaps in a different way. My new pamphlet manuscript explore coming back to one's body after a period of like dissociation from it. So how does one feel and locate joy in the body after pain, right? Or absence? And how does one learn to feel like pleasure relatively late in life? And so a lot of the poems kind of deal with sex and the experience of one's body in relation to another, which is quite new for me. And the short story collection I'm building also hinges on the transformation of the body. So basically, like crazy women turn into things. So like you have a woman turning into a plant, and then another woman turning into a bird. Another woman gets divorced and starts vomiting pearls. And I think this generally reflects like an interest in like the thought process of reinventing yourself, right, through like transformation into versions of yourself you want to become through like creative repetition and like transfigurative.
See, despite being from like very different backgrounds, Lisabelle and I have the exact same interests. I think very, very similar thought processes around our work as well. Because I can like really relate to a lot of that. My short story collection as well was a lot of people turning into things or things coming together and things like this. And for me, I kind of don't know a way to write that's not writing from the body. I can think of it as writing from the body rather than writing about the body now. And I think part of the kind of root of that is when I was really, really little, I had really quite severe eczema. So I immediately the skin of your body, which is supposed to be the thing that kind of is the barrier between you and the world, is very damaged and a site of pain. And but also when I was really little, like a chubby little baby, they used to have to wrap me in bandages every night so I didn't like damage myself in the night. So then there's this idea of you as separate from your body, but also your body is something that can damage you, but that you can damage it at the same time. And I think that kind of rooted me in a really specific way of seeing the world. Like the novel that I have forthcoming, as you mentioned, Jan, people keep people who tell me they like have almost thrown up reading it, and I'm kind of like, oh, okay, it's telling me something about myself because it's so visceral, I think. But then also someone's told me they cried reading it, so I think I can't really get away from the sight of the body as, all our emotions I think of as embodied. And I just, when you grow up as well, especially if you grow up as a woman or you become a woman, the sight of your body then is so politicized. And if you're a woman of color, if you're a disabled woman, if you're a Black woman, if you're a sex worker, all these things politicize your body further and further. And, as you mentioned, Lisabelle, illness is, a very particular axis on that. And I just find these kind of these intersections tell us so much about the world we live in and about the power structures and about the history. So for me, everything we kind of deal with can be seen through that lens, and it's what I'm stuck looking through, apparently.
That's so beautifully said. I definitely like I so relate to this kind of like the tension rises between our heads, like I think for so long I thought I was just like a brain, and then gradually I think my journey of like being quote unquote radicalized as a feminist is to realizing my position in this world as a woman, and how that has, has allowed me for like a various exploitations and also empowered me, is my transformation going from my head, from just the head to the body, and then to find that tension that you have with your body and the tension your body has with the world, and how to translate or sort of transport that into my writing. I think it's been something, it's been kind of getting looming like larger, I think, especially in recent years. So I'm so like resonating with what you both just said. Shall we hear a little bit from, this is like a complete awkward, like a transition from you. It's like, okay, now shall we hear like a little bit from both of you and your writing? So Heather, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to read from Orpheus, as you've already mentioned. And so I've been reading loads about cryogenics lately. So the idea that you can freeze a body after it dies and keep it stable in the hope that, in future years, however many they are, you can then bring that body back to life. And I've been reading this really crazy book from the 60s called The Prospect of Immortality, which is like kind of the text of cryogenics. And while I've been reading it, it reminded me how much of an influence that kind of way of seeing the world had on Wilhelm, who's I have two protagonists in this book, and Wilhelm is the kind of gothic villain kind of one. So I thought I would read a little bit that made me think a lot about the cryogenics book, and kind of sets up his actions in the book and gives his reason for doing what he eventually does. So this is after his beloved grandma has passed away and he's a young child. There she was, the woman I loved, so similar to how she was in life. For a moment, I forgot that she had passed away, and reached out for her hand as if she could reach out and take mine in turn. Her skin, dry but rubbery while she lived, had remained as such, and while desiccation had occurred, there was no visible evidence of putrefaction or excessive rot. She had dried, rather than decayed. It was only then that I recalled the pictures in my grandmother's books, the monks who claimed to have transcended the very concept of death, who were rendered as artworks, as things to be worshipped for millennia. I touched her body, felt her achievement beneath me. She was glorious. It is now, of course, accepted that the surrounding environment has an enormous impact on a body, as does the pre-death diet and lifestyle of the dead. Yet we have previously failed to understand that by treating a dead body as a spent thing, we have robbed our loved ones of any chance they have of returning to their physical form after death. For we have not just discarded it, but have in fact placed it in the worst possible conditions to delay its decomposition. Indeed, by throwing bodies into the pyre, we remove their existence on this plane entirely. Ash cannot support life, and so these souls are destined to expire on whichever plane they exist post-death. Increasingly, it became clear to me that we are engaged as a race in a type of genocide, a grand theft, and that we steal from the recently dead any chance they might have of returning to us. We kill our dead for a second time. In this, we are all guilty. Thank you.
Lisabelle, would you like to read a little bit from your story as well?
Okay, I'm gonna read from a short story called Bodies of Water. And it's about a man whose wife is a selkie. Now start from, and okay, basically like they live in the UK, but they've come back to Singapore where the narrator is from. And that's the context. Yeah, like they're back in Singapore now. Okay. Sometimes we'd lay in bed and her strangeness would wash over me. She clung to me now and then like a pet, nosing for affection. Other times I looked at her doing the laundry or reading a book, utterly contained within herself, and I knew without a doubt that she could leave me and never look back. There existed within her a certainty that she could survive anything. This drew me to her. It also made her a flight risk. Once, driven to consuming nervousness by this self-possessed freedom, I talked to a therapist. There was an online form for this, and I felt a little ridiculous referring myself. There was no section on the form that asked you for details, only a series of drop-down demographic questions, and finally a box for any other relevant information. I put down, I'm afraid my partner will leave me, though we love each other and have no major problems. I'm very anxious that I will self-sabotage. Above all, I want to be with her, ethically. A few weeks later, I had a video call assessment with an NHS-assigned mental health professional. She looked at something on her screen, my form, I assume, then blinked at me with clinical interest. What do you mean when you say you want to be with your partner ethically? She asked. Well, I said, hesitating. I don't want to force her to stay with me. I want her to belong to me of her own free will. When you say belong, that was the wrong word. I mean, I want her to be with me of her own free will. The therapist raised her eyebrows. Is there anything that would make you think this isn't the case? She asked. Well, no, I said, probably too quickly. It felt as if I was digging a hole for myself. All I wanted was actionable advice on how to love a woman whose departure was inevitable. Why do you think you feel so anxious that she will leave? Asked the therapist. Have her actions indicated as such? I thought of the way Ellie stepped out of her skin on the riverbank and walked into our house dripping. A wild creature domesticating herself, ostensibly out of love for me. Well, no, I said again. So perhaps this has more to do with how you see yourself than the reality of the situation. What was I supposed to say to this? I shrugged, then nodded. Perhaps, I said. I want to be careful with how I say this, she said. But some research indicates that men of East Asian descent have trouble with self-image in sexual relationships. I looked at her. Can you feel these feelings you have without attaching them to the future? She asked. This might have been a helpful question for her other patients, but my wife wasn't human. We were fundamentally an accident. If I didn't do something drastic, one day she was going to leave me. That was just fact. Yes, I said. Feelings aren't facts, said the therapist. Yes, I replied. Up close, the skin had a sheen to it, undulating and nacreous. It smelled faintly like iodine. No matter the weather, there was a damp lickness to it. It never stopped shining, succulent, and mucosal. Even hung outside in summer on the hook I'd made from a bent nail. Its contours haunted the edge of my consciousness, and its weight, when I took it in my hands, was surprisingly vast. Sometimes I held it to my face and kissed it. Sometimes I spoke to it, telling it things I could never tell Ellie.
Thank you. It was amazing. I read it a couple of days ago, but like I think hearing you reading it, it really kind of just gives. It's kind of like I learned like how it sounded in your head, Lisabelle, and then like I think the humor really comes through. Maybe I was in a somber mood when I read it, so I just read it. No, it's not like I loved it, and then but I think now like your reading kind of makes me and see it in a different light. It's brilliant. I particularly ask you guys to read from those two pieces of work because I felt like in a strange way they are kind of like in conversation with one another and about like again well-intentioned man maybe like or like and that like the woman's body being like a colonized by a man and like Heather, and in your novel you provided like the voices, the stories from two sides, whereas I think in Lisabelle's short story, which is obviously a much more compacted space, but hopefully we're gonna be able to talk about that later if we have time. But I was so struck by the tension between this kind of like this really smooth like obedience and kind of this like resistant free surface, and then all the like surging undercurrents that were like a whirring underneath the narrative and surface that I kind of just almost like felt a bit creeped out by it. Yeah, we're not gonna talk about it now. Hopefully we'll be able to talk about it later. And so at first I'm gonna ask you guys about the voices in your story. Both of you have crafted distinctive and convincing voices in your story, and Heather has your dual narrator, and then Lisabelle with your male narrator and slash protagonist, June. How did you immerse yourself in these characters and bring in their voice to life so vividly and authentically on the page? Like, how do you kind of, embody those characters and then the voices and making them quite distinct? I'm asking this from a very silly place, really, which is the underlying of that is for me, and that was not my intention, but it's as if I were saying, as writers, we can only write from our own places, from our own identity, our own experience, using our own voices. Obviously, it's not that. But maybe that's like a common myth, kind of sort of believed by other people. And I guess especially for women writers, very unfairly, people view whatever a woman writer writes as like autobiographical, and they always ask you those questions about how your personal experience is related to that. So I was like really struck by how different, your characters and your voices were from you yourself, your ostensive self, anyway. And so that's why I asked this question, although I do understand it is a bit silly for me to ask this, but I'm just going to put on the hat of like a silly audience if there's such a person. And please indulge me and answer this question maybe. Would you like to go first, Lisabelle or Heather?
Unfortunately, I am one of those writers who's quite like autobiographical, which I always feel like, oh no, exactly because of what you said, right? But for that story specifically, I think writing Jun was an experiment with writing in as close to my own voice as possible, which means kind of there's a difference between his inner voice, which is reflected in the narration, right? So the voice of his interior monologue, how he speaks to his British wife, right, in kind of standard English. And then later on in the story, like how he speaks to his Singaporean parents in Singlish, which is basically a Creole with its own grammar and vocabulary. And how I write and how I'm speaking to you guys now is different. Like they're both different, and that's also different from how I speak to like my closest friends, right, or my parents. And so these are all different kind of Englishes that exist in my head, and they're all different parts of the same consciousness, right? And I think this story was an attempt to kind of bring those voices like together in a short, compressed form. I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah, how did I immerse myself in the character? Oh,
No, this is so interesting. Obviously, I did notice the differences, like when he's with his parents and they would say something la, like I know that's like more like a Singaporean sort of touch, but I didn't. This is so, like because I was thinking about the polyphony and the different voices and happenings that were going on in all your stories. I've read several of your stories now, and then I was kind of thinking of that in like maybe this bigger picture of the short story collection. I never realized that in this very conscious way that you are trying to do like different voices and like different Englishes like into the story. Yeah, it's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's making me think about my answer as well. It's actually, you've just kind of made me realize. So people often talk about the different voices in my work, and I really don't tend to write in my own voice very much, and I don't really feel comfortable doing that. But also, I grew up speaking a very, very different kind of English from what you hear out of my mouth now. Like I'm from South Yorkshire, we have a very, very distinct way of speaking and a very distinct accent, so really flat vowels. And I had to kind of learn to speak like this. And then I've lived in a different bunch of countries, so how I spoke changed all that ways. And that's making me think maybe that's like maybe it trains you in a way to then be able to take on these voices in your fiction as well. And I haven't really thought about that, so thank you, Isabel. But yeah, my Orpheus has two protagonists, as you mentioned, and one is Wilhelm, who's German originally and moves to the States, and one is Gabriella, who grows up in Cuba and then moves to the States. And yeah, I mean, if I'm honest, there was no Gabriella in the first book. In the first version of the book, there was only Wilhelm's narration, because what I was really interested in is all the things that are bound up in Wilhelm, which is, white privilege, male privilege, the fascist mindset, or what happens to you when you're brought up thinking that you are like the pinnacle of humanity, and how a person can bring themselves to both do and excuse their doing of the most heinous things in the world. And of course, Gabriella was within the book in the narrative, and she's Luciana's sister, Luciana being the victim of Wilhelm. And I'm really lucky to have and I found his voice so easy to write in, because you can't, like, this guy, right? Like, he's kind of like a classic Gothic villain in a way that he speaks in this kind of highly scientific language in a very formal type of English. Like, once you drop into it, if you've read, Wuthering Heights as many times as I have, or Dracula, it's actually quite easy, because you know it, and you know how they put their sentences together, and you know that they're trying to tell a version of the truth that benefits them. So actually, people ask if he was a horrible character to get into. In a way, it was quite fun. Like, though he's awful and he thinks and he says awful things, it was very easy to write, because we grow up in the world of these people, right? Like, they control things. And I'm really lucky to have a great workshop group with a bunch of very talented writers, and they said it's just too bleak, man. It's just, nobody wants to be in this man's head for like a whole book, and my tolerance for awfulness is very high. And I started to think, and I was like, no, they're right, because there's not enough love in this book. There's love within the narrative, but it's too hidden. It's hidden in Lucy's experience of the world, and she doesn't get a voice in this book. And then I started to think, okay, well, what would it be like to have this voice who stands in some ways in opposition to Wilhelm and what he's saying, and brings a completely different personality to the book? It actually makes it more tragic, I think, when you have that real love, when you have real affection, and we get the other side of the perspective. And I'm really glad she's in the book, but I found her voice a lot more difficult to write, I think.
It's so interesting. Like, just because I was about to ask you, if now you've already mentioned it yourself, like, which one of those two voices is more challenging?
Yeah, I don't know what it says about me that I found it easier to write the horrible fascist guy.
It's like,
No good
actually,
things.
so I worked on a sort of structurally similar thing, like in Chinese. Last year, like, I had this novel came out in Chinese, which I've been working on it off and on for 8 years, and it's exactly the same structure. It's like interwoven dual sort of protagonist. One is like a serious sounding old man, and the other is a young woman. And I find it like horrifyingly easy for me to get into the old man's head, and I really enjoyed writing. I really enjoy writing his chapters in this like a pathological way. Like, I kind of begin to feel worried about myself. And but then the young woman's voice, which is supposed, like, exactly what you were saying, it's supposed to be like a bringing, like, like a hope, kind of like this lightness into the narrative. And it's so difficult. Like, the young woman who's like supposed to be like around my age, and the story like didn't take place now. Now I'm not young, like, like about 20 years ago. So like, uh, anyway, it was so difficult to write her, and I was like, what is wrong with me? I had the same thing when I came out of it. I was like, oh, I need to go see my counselor to talk to her about it.
But it's really hard. It's hard to be sincere. It's actually really hard to write in a way that's interesting about love and affection, because what can you say that's not been said about these things? And when we talk about love and we talk about family, we talk in cliches, and they don't really translate that well to a book. So I think it's, God, I mean, sometimes, like, as when you're a writer and somebody gets married and they say, can you write something to read at the wedding? And every time I just want to walk into the sea, because I'm like, no, I can't. It will be awful in the end, and I'll cry, and no, I can't do it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like, I like eccentricity. Eccentricity is like sort of the goals, like, in writing. Kind of feel, if you have like eccentric character, eccentric voice, it is actually relatively manageable to grip. Whereas if you have like Yeah, like a loving kind of benign, like this, you wanted to do something that is like slightly uplifting. It's like so almost like antithesis of like to like literature as I understand it. I'm just like, oh, I can't do this. This is too positive. I completely feel what you're saying. Yeah. Um, well, I think so. I think let's move forward to I have sent all the questions to you guys beforehand. Let's like I always like have to like tell people like we have a script. Cannot, but I think I'm gonna jump like no, I kind of just I cannot like I'm very bad at I could pretend something is not there when it is there. So I would just like immediately come forward. Although nobody else has asked me to, like nobody wants to know this. Like they don't really care. But I'm like, okay, I'm gonna confess. This is what happened. I prefer the questions. I've send the questions to. But I think we're just gonna. I'm looking at the time. I thought maybe we should skip the next one and then I just really wanted to talk to you about like, this, I feel this is one thing also like really struck me when I was reading your stories and novels. And it is like you're both writing in different ways and to different extent about and from other places. Of course, I have to say like this other is predicated on the presumed center we're speaking from, which in this case is the Anglophone world. So Heather, when you decided to work on Orpheus Builds a Girl, were you at all intimidated or actually intrigued by the challenge of portraying a Cuban family and a German doctor in the 1950s Florida? What was your process for capturing the essence of that time, place, and these characters' lives so brilliantly? And Lisabelle, we touched on like in our previous tutorial that your intention to depict a different Singapore and Southeast Asia in your stories, pushing back against the prevailing stereotypes often associated with this region. Would you expand on that? Because I thought that's really interesting what you said, like last time we spoke. How does being the writer from elsewhere shape the decisions you make in your writing and the stories you choose to tell? So, Heather, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. What a great question. I really was intimidated. Yeah. So actually, there's 3 places I've written about. One is Florida, one is Cuba, and one is Germany. And I have lived in North America and I have lived in Central America. So these places weren't like completely alien to me, but I didn't live in Cuba and I didn't live in Florida. Um, and similarly, haven't lived in Germany. But what was complicated for me was that the story that Office is based on, it's based on a real thing that happened in 1920s Florida. And I heard this story on a podcast in maybe 2017, and I was so consumed with rage about how it was told, because it was told as if it was a love story, and it still is told. And sorry, the podcast didn't tell it as a love story, but a lot of people who lived in Florida spoke about it as if it was. And to me, it was so obviously a story of white privilege and racism and, the different, how immigration works differently for different people, but also racialized bodies, female bodies, where, the female person is situated in the wider world. I don't know. So I really wanted to tell the story in a way that challenged this way of seeing it and made us see that the you just can't assume possession over a person in this way. But our systems all do encourage this and allow for this, and men get away with this all the time. So I was kind of caught in one ways in being true to the story and also writing about things that I felt I could do well. And for me, it would yes, it was a challenge to write an immigrant experience, 2 different immigrant experiences. But had I changed that detail, it would not have been emotionally true. And it would have been doing a huge disservice. And then it would have been a different thing. And then I would have been trying to talk about the same thing, but in a much less powerful and less true way. So I had a lot of help in things. I had my German friend read over the book. I had my Cuban friend who moved to the States and then moved to Central America. I had her read over the book. I got help with the names and I got help with the details. And I went to Dresden and I went to Cuba. And the old town of Cuba that I write about is very much like the old town of Panama that I lived in. So I tried to draw out the similarities between things I had experiences with and focus on them. But also I really immerse myself in the history of both situations. But I mean, I really did make it difficult for myself in a lot of ways. But I just think you, as a writer, you kind of have to take that risk sometimes if you're trying to make impactful work that really speaks to the kind of reality of the world. I don't know how you feel, Isabel.
I'm just like absorbing, to be honest. Like top 10 here, you've said a lot of brilliant things. I'm just like, my mind is expanding. But yeah, I mean, I agree.
I find what you're saying, Heather, and also like reading this novel, and it's extremely empowering and inspiring for me, and I'm sure it's going to be for a lot of writers because we kind of live in the era of like whose story were you allowed to tell to the point that it's really like comically restraining, and it's like it's almost like a new censorship. And I think it is absolutely right that one can tell whatever one wants to tell. One can tell from wherever one finds the emotional truth. So I think that is absolutely the ethos behind the novel, behind your um, practice of writing this novel. And I also find, I think one thing that for me really worked was like we're looking in at this world like 1950s Florida from, or like the country Cuba and Germany, like from the character's point of view, like it's not from like a third person, like so the world is not being exoticized. Like they're talking about the world they're most familiar with. They're talking about their everyday. They're talking about their life. So they don't need to like particularly sort of highlight or like just to say, oh, look, this is. And so everything was being treated in this like complete, like mundane, like in this kind of completely internalized, normalized way. And I think that is hugely helpful for like me as a reader going into the texture of the story, like believing in the texture of the story because the character believed in it so sincerely, so kind of movingly in their own way. And then that kind of just completely erased my sort of a potential suspense. Like when you get into as a reader, like a novel narrative, you'll be like, oh, where I am, do I trust it? And I think because the narrators, their voices are so convincing because they trust their reality so much. And that kind of completely erased all the questions, the suspenses I would otherwise potentially have. So yeah. I know this is not my time. I feel like I'm talking too much as a chairperson.
You're saying many great things. But yeah, like what you said about voice, if there's any concrete thought in my head now, it was that like the voices in Orpheus Builds the Girl are so distinct. And I feel like the emotional truth that you talked about is so tied to your voice, right? And it was the voice that just kept me reading like all of it in one night, right? And I think because the voice was just so strong, or rather the voices, right? They were so specific and they were so emotionally true. And just on a word by word level, which is like very key to me, I think, in like how I immerse myself in the truth of a story. That's how you build kind of the sentences word by word. That's like, rang like true. So which is why I suppose I'm having trouble responding to the, the more big picture part.
Like, I don't know if you guys agree. I think if you are going to write from a perspective that is not your own, which is for most of us the vast majority of what we write, right? Like, so I have also never lived in London, and I have never been locked in an attic by my mother, but that's the conceit of my new novel. I have never been a Victorian woman, like we're always playing what if games, like games of what if this was my experience, what if that was the life I was living. And I do think you can do things poorly, and I think you can do them thoughtlessly, and I think you can do them in a way that perpetuates the worst kind of structures of the world. So I do really think we have to be kind of thoughtful and careful about these things. But also I think the idea that you can only write your perspective actually hurts marginalized writers more than anything, because there's an idea that you then have to write about your experience. You have to write about this, you have to write about that. And I find that can be very limiting for everybody.
Yes, 100%. Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking of, like when Yen like sent us these questions, right? I feel like okay, first, like I'm not necessarily trying to depict like a different Singaporean, just my own experience of it. And just by existing, I guess, as a voice, as a Singaporean voice in like the Anglophone world, like I think by definition that tend to be different. 'Cause a lot of people still think that Singapore's in China, for example. But but yeah, I think the stereotype like of Southeast Asia are still quite present with us, right? Like I don't know if you guys watched The White Lotus, the HBO series. Okay, it's brilliant. By the way, the first season was set in Maui and the second season was set in Sicily. So like huge, like it's a huge show, right? Like won lots of awards and stuff like that. And the third season, which is coming out next year. And to be clear, I love this show. Okay, it's set in Thailand. And if you've seen the promos for the show, suddenly mysteriously in Thailand, right, there's a yellow filter that appears. You know how sometimes films set in like Central America, there's like that filter, like the very visual filter to signal we are not in Europe and we are not in North America. Like there's a similar filter like in the third one, and I was just thinking, like, what is the literary equivalent of this yellow filter, right? And I think often the market kind of encourages writing about certain subjects in certain ways that are palatable and appealing to like Anglophone readers because they are different enough and they are signaled to be different in a certain way, right? And so there's this expectation, like you said, Heather, to write from this narrowly defined like cultural well. Um, and I feel that way, like as a Southeast Asian and as an East Asian writer, like it's easier to sell myself, to sell my writing if I write about these things, right? Um, and sometimes I feel like these days it's sometimes easier, for me to tell my story about like Pontianaks and Penangalans, right? Rather than if I wanted to write a Dracula story, right? It's probably easier for me because I'm like, oh, I'm Southeast Asian, I know all this folklore, like here's my Pontianak story. It's probably easier to tell. Or like, people want to read about the Japanese occupation in like World War II Southeast Asia. Or if you're Singaporean, you're writing about authoritarian government, oppressive education system, racial tensions, and then everything set in a HDB. And HDB is like the house, like it's our public housing, basically. 85% of Singaporeans live in public housing. And all these things, if done well, and there's obviously so much good work out there about all these things. And I've also obviously written about them myself. If done well, it's great, right? But my own personal obsession include just very not typically Southeast Asian things. Like I write a lot, I'm subjected Yen to a lot of Catholic stories. Like all my Catholicism has come on full force, and then I'm sure she must be thinking, why is there always a priest or a nun involved? I really love, the lives of the saints, like the female involvement with like medieval textual culture. I want to write a Gawain novel, but these often feel like spaces that don't have room for like voices like mine, right? Like I want to write a Gawain novel, but I do wonder like first of all, who's gonna want to read a Gawain novel? And secondly, like realistically, who's gonna want to read a Gawain novel written by a Singaporean? I can easily say, hey, here's my World War II Japanese occupation story. I'm Singaporean. My grandmother lived through this. Like, by my book, right? Like, if I'm like, I'm gonna write this retelling of Gawain, it's like, and I'm Singaporean, people don't really see that. But by God, I'm gonna do it anyway. I can write whatever I want.
Yes. I will be at the front of the queue for that book.
Yes, absolutely. And do it. And, like I was saying to you, and when we last spoke, is about like, I think, yes, right, like a Singaporean Catholic stories. And I think very often when we think there's no space for things like that, it's because we haven't tried ourselves to stretch out the space. And I think a lot of things were like written into existence. And especially, like we talked about this. I don't want to turn this into our like a mini chat, but like just to say quickly, like as writers from elsewhere, really, and I think even like in the Anglosphere where we see there are like if you're a working class writer from England, you like there are always this sense of like not belonging, of trying to assimilate yourself to the power center and then to try to like submit yourself to kind of being like to coerce yourself into mimicking the imagination of you and your people coming from the power center. But I think fundamentally everybody is to write against that urge, that kind of calling from the power center, because because it is like a decentralized. I hope, like, maybe this is my wishful thinking, like, considering where we are now with what's going on in this world, like, still singing this like optimistic sound seems maybe a bit silly, but still, like, I believe we are like living in a decentralized world. We are on the way of establishing multiple centers, even in the English world, like, so I do think it's so meaningful that you're doing what you're doing. And okay, I'm gonna stop.
Reading both your short stories lately has actually been really like centering for me again, because I am currently writing a short story collection and I had kind of forgotten how to do it. And I had also become overwhelmed with this idea that I wasn't doing it right, because I wasn't writing the kind of short stories that would be winning the BBC Short Story Prize. And, the kind of two people are having a tense conversation about their relationship and then that's the story. Mine are much more like concept driven. They're much more like weird. And reading the two of yours work lately has been like, oh yeah, I can write like what I'm doing, or I can say what I'm trying to say. I can come up with these strange concepts and I can write into them. And it's really funny how people link you to other writers. So I'm like really obsessed with J.G. Ballard at the moment, the like 60s British writer who grew up in Shanghai and, had these fascinating view of technology. I'm actually so much more inspired by like him right now than like Angela Carter, who is the person that you always get brought up if you're a woman of a certain age in the UK. And it's like, yeah, actually it's like, I like the writing of pushing away. I like that idea. It's the writing to push away from what you should be writing. I like that.
I also see it as like a reverse plundering. Singapore was a colonial subject, right?
Yeah.
Like we were a colony, like we were a British colony. And like sometimes I do feel like this sense of like ownership, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna reach down into this history that's both not my own, but also kind of is, because I'm claiming a past which is like has been unnaturally given, right? And has its faced, past that otherwise might have been. But like, what are they gonna do, right? Like they colonized us, and so I feel I have a right to do whatever I want with these like medieval English. Yeah, anyway.
That's absolutely the spirit. I think I mentioned this in a lot of places, like, but I do think, the world's like, when we talk about like the concept of like literature written in English, like previously that might have been called English literature, but nowadays, because of the colonial history really, and how English becoming this lingua franca and having different versions of English in different parts of the world, and really now it is the world of like literatures in English. It's like different kinds of literatures, but written in English. So in that sense, I don't have zero age urge, like wanting to fit into like writing into like English literature, and because really it's like literatures in English. So I completely agree with what you're saying, Lisabelle. And yeah, I think you're doing great. Like you're having some great work delivered, really. I thought I wanted to end like with like, again, fun questions. I don't know if you guys want to ask each other a question, or have you already done that? Do you want to do that very quickly? Because I know Lisabelle really admires Heather's work. I'm also a big fan of both of your works. So yeah, like do you want to do this? Do you want to like ask each other a question?
Yes, I have already told Heather, like before you joined the call, I got all my fangirling out of the way. Okay, my real question is, how has your process or your experience, although you kind of answered this a bit just now, but okay, changed from writing like Orpheus Builds, which was your debut, right, to like Carrion Crow? Do you feel your process has changed at all?
So kind of not really. So it's kind of a cheat second novel. Everyone says your second novel is the hardest. I wrote this before I sold Orpheus. So I actually wrote Carrion Crow in lockdown in May 2020 and then finished it I think I said it to my agent the week we were sending Orpheus out on submission, which is so not the way you're supposed to do anything. And she kind of couldn't do anything with it for 2 years. And I wrote that from like a real place of like rage and anger and fear and all these kind of things. And my actual process, what I've realized now, like we mentioned this a little bit before, Lisabelle, like I think writing novels, you have to try on so many different modes that you learn from other people, and so few of them actually work for you that you have to go through these horrible processes to figure out which one is yours. And mine is that I have to like absorb so much over like the course of years. You know, I think of it as magpieing. You like magpie little things out of real life and history and facts, and you put them all in your little kind of brain nest. And then when you're eventually ready to sit down and hatch an egg, it will actually happen for me quite quickly. So I like to try and write a first draft within like 6 weeks, and then really get out of your own way as well, because you can obsess over everything. You have to write some rubbish in that first draft. I mean, it's mainly rubbish, but it's there then to work on. So that was kind of the same for the 2 books for me. So the third novel, it's going to be awful because I will then I'll have all my second novel drama, but in my third novel, I think. So yeah, it's going to be awful.
But do you know what, funny? Like, okay, obviously I've not written a novel, and again, I don't know if I have one in me, but I work very much the same way. I accrete a lot, and then just vomit. Like, it builds and I just like get it out.
Well, actually, so my question for you is kind of about process, but a little bit more broadly. I know you're working on a short story collection right now, and so am I. And I think you write short stories so beautifully and so convincingly. Each one convinces you so much of itself. So I was just wondering if you can give me any advice. Like, what is how do you sit down and write a short story? Because I have completely forgotten how to do it.
Great. I love your work so much. I don't know. No, I mean, like I said, I really just, have either of you read like Lady Smith's lecture on writing stories? I don't remember which. Like where she talks about building a house. Okay, like, yeah, so she says that there are 2 kinds of writers, right? Like kind of like the architect and the micromanager. And she talked about herself as like a micromanager. Where like instead of building the whole structure, like she's just gonna obsessively build one room, right, before moving on to the next. And like the carpet and the draping and the art and everything has to be there before moving on. And that's just kind of like how I write, right? Just on a word by word level, which is utterly useless to you because like I said just now, your word by word is already like so brilliant. But yeah, I love personally building a story like word by word and by ear. Yeah. Which is then why Yen has been so helpful. Like she's been my residency mentor and has been asking me really like simple questions to which I have no answer. Like, when did this happen in the timeline? And I'm like,
Or the classic question for a short story, which I used to get from my mentor back in the day, was, what is this really about? And I used to hate that question because I could never answer it. And that was the problem with the story.
I think if I can expand on that, I don't know if we have time. I'm going to say this. I think then we're probably running out of time. I also had this have regularly discussed. I've regularly discussed the idea of like about or the aboutness with other writers, especially working on short stories. And I would often say, first you need to understand what the aboutness of your story, as in what your story is about, and second, you need to resist the aboutness of your story, because if the actual story the finished story ended up being able to be summed up by aboutness, then that story fails, because a short story fundamentally is to resist that aboutness. So I feel like that's like a two-phased process. You kind of first maybe I think it's like George Saunders might have said something similar along the line of like you sort of hatch your idea on this one platform and then finish it on in a complete different place on a complete different platform. And I think if that didn't happen, then you're not doing it right. I think this is probably like along the similar line of like you understand this aboutness and then you completely shatters, destroys, and disrupts, deconstructs it in your actual finished story.
That's brilliant. And that really, so I have been reading elsewhere and really loving
I
it.
sent you a copy. I'm so
No. So now I'm just thinking of all the stories with that context. And yeah, it's such a brilliant book. Yeah, and honestly, I've been really enjoying it. So I will take that with me, both pieces of advice, into my trying to write this book.
I think now we're officially out of time, so we're going to wrap this up. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. And thank you for Lisabelle and Heather for joining me for this brilliant, reinvigorating conversation. And thank you for the National Center for Writing and the National Art Council of Singapore for supporting this event. And thank you for Ellie and Martin for being our guardian angels throughout this whole process. Thanks very much.
And thank you, Yan, for the
Thank
awesome
you.
chair.
Yeah, it was brilliant.